Buon pomeriggio. Welcome everybody. I think we should get started. This is the first panel of a long afternoon of exploration of questions of poetry across, of translation across poetry and prose. My name is Eugenio Refini. I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies here at NYU, and I'm welcoming you all also on behalf of Stefano Albertini, the director of Casa, Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò, who is co-sponsoring this event. We are very, very happy to be once again part of this group of institutions collaborating on projects connected to both translation broadly meant and of course contemporary literature. I think over the past few years we have primarily focused on prose. We did have some poetry last year in the installment of Multipli Forti. We are now getting today to a series of panels on translation, and the very first one is going to be focused on poetry, which is, I think, a very important thing to do, and we will be very pleased to have specialists in the field, scholars, authors, poets, translators, to really tackle questions about, what it means to be doing poetry today, what it means to be translating poetry across languages, of course, and the relevance of all these to broader questions about what literature is. So art and craft in translation, meetings and dialogues on literary translation. We started yesterday with a session up at the Italian Cultural Institute of New York. This morning, the program continued up at Hunter College, at CUNY. More events to happen tomorrow in town. Calandra Institute and Rizzoli Bookstore. So make sure that you're going to check the program online. But without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce the first panel of our series today. Again, we begin with poetry, then we will switch on to prose and broader discussions of translations and across languages, with a focus on what happens really when we think about translating from Italian into English, but more broadly about this kind of cross-pollination of questions. And then we will end up the day with a session on recent translations of Cesare Pavese. So the idea was really to begin broadly and then end the day with a case study of a freshly translated set of works. The first panel, Poetry, Exploring Poetry, as of the very title, gives you a sense of the idea behind the discussion. The idea, of course, is that in order to have a good translation, you typically need to have a good writer who's also a translator. In the case of poetry, one could argue that translators of poetry are inevitably poets themselves. I mean, we could expand on this question, and I'm sure that this will come up in the discussion. And we have three ideal interlocutors for this conversation. Two external, so to say, outside guests, Carmen Gallo and Patrizio Ceccagnoli, who will be in conversation with Isabella Livorni. Carmen Gallo is a poet, translator, as well as a professor of English literature at the Sapienza University in Rome, and she's very active on all these fronts, including recent publications, both as a poet and as a translator. And we will hear from her about that. Patrizio Ceccagnoli, who's also a translator, but also a professor. He comes to us from the University of Kansas, and he's also involved with the Italian Poetry Review. So the ideal person to talk about, again, what happens when we think broadly about this transatlantic, transnational movement of poetry across linguistic codes and cultural codes. And they are moderated by our own Isabella Livorni, the assistant professor of Italian Studies here in the Department of Italian Studies at NYU. And she's an expert of many things, but poetry is a big part of her research. She's also a translator, so she has her hands on different fields which are relevant to our discussion today. And she has a very keen, eye on questions of intermediality. And one could even argue that poetry is quintessentially about intermediality in many different ways. And I'm sure that she has prepared wonderful talking points for this conversation. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our speakers to the podium. I will actually to the stage, no podium, and let's enjoy this afternoon of conversations. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you so much for being here. And thank you especially to Carmen and Patrizio for being here and in conversation with us. We're going to start off with some questions about Carmen and Patrizio's translation practice. And then we're going to transition into some readings and some more granular questions about their translation choices. So I wanted to start with a kind of general but also somewhat personal question. How did you become translators?
Am I to begin?
Sure, you can start.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm very happy to be here with Isabella and Patrizio and to participate to this event on translation. Actually, I didn't decide to become a translator. It was not a moment in my life, and I said, I'm going to be a translator. While studying at university, I studied English and Japanese, and so I spent some time of my life translating text just for myself, because as we all know, when you translate a text, you have the impression you're really getting into it. And so it was, and when you're young, you're always like not very satisfied with others' translations. So you're very thinking, yeah, I need to do my own translations. And then I forget about it. And a few years later, I received an email asking me if I wanted to translate Shakespeare. And I was young, and I was not very aware of what I was doing. And I said, yes, of course, I'm going to translate Shakespeare. What's the problem? In a year, no problem, I can do whatever. And this is how it started. And I kept on translating things that were proposed to me. And sometimes I chose a few things.
Well, I'm also an unexpected, maybe a reluctant translator, and it's also my activity started in relation to my education, because I was trained in Italy as a classicist, so I wasted my youth translating ancient Greek and Latin. And when I was 17, I competed in the Certamen Florentino as a translator from ancient Greek to Latin, and I failed miserably at that. And then I won a medal as a Certamen Orazianum in Venosa, or as hometown. That was my greatest glory today in my life. And eventually in grad school, I took, in the spring of 2004, in one institution uptown, a class on poetry, on contemporary Italian poetry, taught by an Italian scholar and poet, Paolo Valesio. And that summer I interviewed in Genoa Eduardo Sanguinetti and Milo De Angelis. And I started as an interviewer, as a scholar of their poetry. Then eventually a mentor and friend of mine, was a poet and scholar and translator, Susan Stewart, asked me to collaborate with her as she was working on a special issue of Tri-Quarterly with Robert Harrison from Stanford, an issue related, all devoted to Italian poetry, and we translated poetry of Sanguinetti and Milo De Angelis. And eventually, during grad school, and Paolo Valesio actually, and during grad school, we started. I continued to do this work on the side as a side job, interfering with my scholarly activity. And eventually, in 2013, we published a first volume that contains 2 books of poetry by Milo De Angelis for Chicago University Press. We actually presented it here in the library upstairs with Stefano, and I have a beautiful picture made by Viviana Nicodemo, the partner of Milo De Angelis here at NYU. It's a beautiful memory. So happy to come back here 13 years later.
I mean, some of these questions, I'm going to jump around in my questions, because I'm curious. We were talking about poetry, exploring poetry. Carmen, you are a poet in your own right. Patrizio, you do not consider yourself a poet.
Not, maybe I'm becoming one, but I'm not a published poet.
Okay. So what is the relationship between translation and your own poetics? Patrizio, you can also speak on this if you in your developing poetics?
Yes, I'm joking about it. I'm not planning to give you another bad poet, but I'm actually very happy to be on this stage with a long-listed poet for the Strega Award as Carmen Gallo, whose last book is very triumphant in Italy and reprinted already after the recent public release. I'm not a poet, but as I said, it's better to have a translator who's not a poet than a poet who's not a translator, in a way that, because I think translating is a very good formative training exercise for a poet, for a writer in general. So I think the distinction is sometimes a cliche, but also too dogmatic. And I think I'm a scholar of poetry. I've been reading and studying poetry all my life, and as a scholar of poetry, as a classicist, I read poetry, and eventually it was natural to me to provide to the American audience, for instance, an English translation of the poet I wanted to talk about. And people told me, why don't you write a book about that? I said, why should I write a secondary literature about an author whose primary literature is not available to the audience? So it would be like a Eusterum Proteron, to use a literary device. And so I wanted to share my passion from some writer I read in English also that were not available to the Italian audience, and I proposed them to publishers. And that became a steady profession, but it was not meant to be. And I can stop here for now.
No, it's what you're saying. It's so useful also to those of us who teach mixed classes in the United States, mixed of Italian language speakers and not Italian language speakers. And Italian poetry is so sparsely translated. What you do is a favor to many of us who want to teach Italian poetry.
Bless your heart.
And Carmen, what about for you? How does poetry translation in your poetic practice?
Yeah, I have to confess that I started writing poetry while I was translating poetry in English. I never thought about writing poetry before I start studying T.S. Eliot. And I always say that it was a kind of revenge to translate Eliot later, because it is his fault that I started writing poetry. It was his fault that I became this black and white figure that is what we call a poet. I agree with Patrizio when he says, I don't think that you need to be a poet to translate poetry. You really need to know where poetry is going. You need to know the poetical tradition of that country, and you need to read a lot of poetry, but you don't really need to be a poet. And also, what is that thing that we are calling to be a poet? I translated a few texts before I published my book, and nobody considered that books as translation by a poet. Then I translated a few books, and I was a published author. But it's just me, he's the same person. So sometimes there are some translators that have their own way of translating that has a literary value that is totally comparable to that of a poet, even if he chooses not to write or not to publish his or her or their poems. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's funny, actually, the way that it's shaping up with both of your answers. It's less that you need to be a poet to translate poetry. You need to be a scholar to translate poetry.
It helps.
Yes. I'm curious, in terms of... I want to talk a bit about collaboration in a minute, but before we talk about collaboration, I want to talk about what you do when you're translating poets or authors more broadly who are still alive. This is something, the translation act sits between reproduction and production, right? It's in this kind of liminal zone, and it can be a really amazing opportunity to develop a kind of relationship with a living author. It can also be a difficult relationship to undertake. And I'm curious, what have your experiences been? Do you seek out Patrizio, you've translated Anne Carson, Antonella Nedda, Milo De Angelis, all still living. Carmen, even though we're going to talk a lot about your translations of dead poets, you have translated British playwright Carol Churchill, and there came out a translation of Hannah Sullivan, British poet Hannah Sullivan's poetry in Italian. So what relationships, if any, do you have with these living authors?
Yeah, I can be very short about that because I translated Hannah Sullivan, but we weren't in touch I just met her a few weeks ago. So at the end, when the translation had been already published, and it seems like she was not so much interested in this kind of exchange with the translators. I did it with Riccardo Frolloni. We did a collaborative translation. So it feels like I had more dialogue with my dead poets.
So please address question for translator of dead poets to Carmen. I will only answer to question about living poets. But joking aside, yes, it happened that I only translated living poets as a part of my activity as what Alessio, my mentor, will call critica militante. But it's also I actually translated Sando Penna, who is not among us anymore, as a poet from my hometown for a Nuovi Argomenti issue devoted to him. But in the form of a book, I only translated living poets, contemporary poet, and I started as a translator of Italian contemporary poetry in collaboration with a poet and a scholar and a translator who's Susan Stewart, with whom I translated all my English books. But yes, obviously we are all person. Writers are person, and they all have their own personality and traits and moods and phases of their career and their life. So our interaction are the normal interaction between different people, and they can go smoothly and they can go wrong, and it really depends on many factors, on the age and the health, on the sentimental life of somebody. Maybe I don't know. So I'm one of those, as Salinger says in The Catcher in the Rye, that when you love a book, you really wish you could make a phone call to the author and become best friends, right? Something like that. So in a way, that I became an admirer and a reader of Anne Carson, who was a cult figure in New York when I was in graduate school. Maybe my friend Steve Baker was always a more advanced reader than me of American literature and English literature. Introduced me to her. I don't remember exactly, but you cannot go in a New York bookstore without finding Anne Carson books. But only when I end up in Kansas, in jail, but I became a translator of Anne Carson because 1 month after my arrival in Kansas, I went to an event for the retirement of a renowned translator, Stan Lombardo, mostly famous for his translation from the classics, who is an emeritus professor in the Department of Classics in my same University of Kansas. And in honor of his career, Anne Carson was a friend of his, who invited him at NYU as a guest speaker in her classes, as a visiting speaker here. Anne Carson participated in the enactment, in a production of her modern rendition of Sophocles' Antigone called Antigonique. And Carson, so there was a representation of this lyrical play by Anne Carson from 2012, I think, published with New Directions, in which the character of Nick, as in Nick of Time, a mute character, wanders around the stage, saying nothing but measuring all things, maybe as a negative emblem of our quantitative approach to life. Stan Lombardo was Nick, and Anne Carson was a choral voice appearing on a mega screen on a Skype video call. And thanks to Stan Lombardo, I became in touch with Anne Carson, who read my Italian translation. At first, she didn't seem to be very interested in being translated in Italian or not too eager, and so the presses were not too, fighting to have to acquire a Carson copyrights. But eventually became a long collaboration. She answered to my emails more quickly than my students. But she can be very blunt and funny and dismissive at the same time. And I love her. And it's her style, and her emails are equally beautiful. I learned not to bother her and not to ask for explanations. She doesn't want to. She doesn't seek clarity in her poetry. She doesn't want to explain herself comprehensively. So, whereas other poets have a different poetics and attitude toward their own poetry. For instance, I visited Milo De Angelis in his house. Milo De Angelis is a teacher. He's also a translator from the classics. Translated a very popular translation of Lucretius De Rerum Natura, and also more recently he translated Baudelaire, The Fleur de Mal, and now he's translating Ovid, The Metamorphoses, but he also translated Claudianus and other writers. And so I could ask Milo what he actually meant and discuss about that with Susan Stewart. And it happens also that we nevertheless chose a solution that was against the clear stated intention of the writer because we thought, having deliberated on the matter, that our version could work better in English, and Milo allowed that. And I'm so proud to say that I'm a friend of Antonella Nedda, so sometimes this translation can lead to friendship, and Susan Stewart also referred to this endeavors like an experiment in friendship. And so it's a mission accomplished. I'm a professor of literature because I love literature, so I love to have a friend who is a writer, who is a poet. I love to be able to text them and say, hey, what do you mean here, and what do you think about this other book? And so a translation can be an act of scholarly conversation and interaction with a living author, and a way to have an intellectual exchange among authors and translators.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of exchange, this relational act of translation, when you co-translate, how does that go? I have limited experience. My only kind of co-translations have happened with my own sister, which is its own kind of can of worms. So thinking instead about you and your you have a long-standing collaboration with Susan Stewart. You, Carmen, you were just talking about Riccardo Frolloni, your collaboration with Hannah Sullivan, the Hannah Sullivan translation. How does that work for you guys?
Oh, okay. I don't know how much I can be sincere about it, but Riccardo let me decide everything. Liked more. He was very he was very nice. He completely trusted me because the story is that he had already completed his own translation of Hannah Sullivan when I stepped in, and so I tried to work on his translation with respect, but also I wanted to change a few things. So I sent him a draft with all my revisions and proposals, and he was very kind to accept most of it. But then we have been discussing. It was a long work. It was 6 years. We've been working together, not every month, but consistently. There were hypotheses. We changed our minds on several things through the years. So it was a very long and quite hard journey, I have to say. But I learned a lot. I have to say, I learned a lot because when you're translating all by yourself, you have your own idea. You don't really have to negotiate with somebody else. You only have to negotiate a lot with the author you're translating. But he's also younger, so he has probably a different idea of what poetry is or should be. So it was also interesting from we are from different generations. And I really think that translating is always related to also even to a sort of political vision of literature. So when you're dealing with someone that is younger, it changes something about your own vision of literature, or sometimes even the idea you received, and then you have to question when you're working with someone else.
Yes, we were talking earlier about the translation always being historicized.
Yeah, yeah, I really believe that, and this is one of the reasons I spend so much time and energy retranslating. I retranslated Eliot, I retranslated Shakespeare, because it's really time, I think, to retranslate a lot of texts, because there are a lot of cultural biases in the translation we are still reading. There are a lot of examples that can be done. Wilson made a wonderful work on Homer, for example, but also in Italy we still have translations of Shakespeare Othello that has the N word in it. And it is weird because Shakespeare never used that word. But so why are we reading Othello in Italian with such a strong and cultural bias? That makes no sense. And also a lot of gender biases. In Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare, in most of translation, Juliet is like a silly girl. Her sexual desire is completely omitted, cancelled, because it's too complicated to deal with. So I really think there's a lot to do in Italy with retranslation of classics, because we are giving our students a lot of works which are embedded, in a sense, with cultural biases we definitely have to get rid of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Patrizio, we've talked about this. You've never had experience retranslating. I'm curious, though, about your collaboration with Susan Stewart and what it's like for you to translate. You've translated both into Italian and into English. What are the kind of differences that you're dealing with there?
I try to quit translating because I have to go back to my scholarly work, and my colleagues want me to. But I'm joking. I don't think I will. But I don't mind to collaborate. One thing about writing as a solitary activity, this romantic idea with solitary genius tormented at home. But as a physicist collaborate, also a translator can collaborate. I wouldn't translate your sister, maybe, or my sister. You have to find the right collaborator. It can be an energizing activity of exchange. You have to have a method, or you have to accept compromise. I have to say that about collaboration, in a way, also Carmen and I collaborated, even if she's too ashamed to admit that. But I met her today for the first time. On the 21st of April, a book will be released in Italy by Crocetti Feltrinelli, on which we both worked separately. But Anne Carson, Gender of Sun, will be released with my revised translation and an afterwards written by Carmen. So I'm very proud of being published with Carmen. And so I'm particularly proud and very proud to have worked with Susan Stewart. I learned a lot. Of course, I'm not a native speaker of English, and even I've been naturalized. I've been living in this country for 20 years, so I usually do my solo translation from English into Italian. But I love to collaborate with friends and authoritative, smart friends. I call Susan my brilliant friend, and as the Ferrante's novel translation, she asked me to work together, and it proved to be very, very productive. And we usually, if you want to ask about the practicalities, how we do it, it depends, obviously, on the authors and the book. I mean, we speak about translation and literature, general assumption, but as I said before, we're all different people and different poets, different books that require different approaches and different translation. And each of us will approach maybe that task differently. When I work with Susan, usually I provide a preliminary English translation with commentaries and footnotes about problematic passages, maybe cultural references, things that might get lost in translation, ambiguities that might be lost choosing one version rather than another one. And we go with a back and forth. Usually I never... I write very differently when I translate, and it's much less painful for me to translate than to write, because when I write my own story work, when I write my own things, I'm a tormented writer who wants to come up with a perfect sentence, and is stuck until I'm stuck until I'm content with the sentence. Whereas when I translate, I tend to process all the material at once and then go back to it multiple times, and every time to gradually, progressively repolish it. Either when I'm alone and when I'm with Susan, the same. We progress with a series of exchanges and a back and forth on the same text. Well, we don't divide the material. It's not a type of collaboration in which I translate one section and she translates another one independently. Everything we do, we translate together, so that there is a unitary voice, a unitary style that is the fruit of this compromise collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean, I want to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to make sure that we get to our readings. And as how we're going to proceed, Carmen is going to read some of her translations and some of her poetry. And we'll kind of discuss some of the choices that she made. And I'll have a few questions, then we'll go to Patrizio. So that will be our plan for how to proceed. And then I have some more questions. We'll open it up for any questions that you might have as well in the audience. Carmen, I'll hand it over to you and to kind of read the text that you've selected for us.
Okay. As we wanted to give some practical examples of what is translation and all the challenges and desperate moments we had while translating, I chose the very beginning of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, so the famous April opening, and then I'll tell you something, a very short quotation. I'll read it in English, but obviously you already know it, but then I read my translation. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. My translation. Aprile è il mese più crudele, genera lì dalla terra morta, mescola memoria e desiderio, pungola le radici ottuse con pioggia primaverile. L'inverno ci teneva al caldo, copriva la terra di neve dimentica, nutriva con tuberi secchi una vita minima. As you can see, the most difficult thing here is that there's an alliteration in E, April, breeding, mixing, stirring, no? There's a lot of E. And it is really that very disturbing noise, it's like scratching a blackboard, or at least this is my idea, not that you really, that something that wants to take you back from death, and so it is like provoking this very disturbing noise. And there are in English all these impersonal gerundives forms, like breeding, mixing, stirring, covering, feeding. And in Italian, you cannot use gerundio because it is not impersonal.
Right, it makes no
doesn't
sense
work. Yeah, but still, I wanted to preserve the sound of breeding, mixing. That last sound that is very
the nasal.
And so I chose genera, that has an N in it, and I chose mescola, that has an M, and then pungola, that has the ng sound, to try to recreate in different words the pattern of this nasal sound. And I made other choices like primaverile, that has a lot of E in it, and also copriva, nutriva, and the strongest one is minima, little life. Also because if I translate little life with piccola, little life, piccola vita, it sounds nice. Piccola vita is something that is a good thing, piccola vita. while little life, it means that there is not so much life remaining. So I used minima to suggest this idea of life that is fainting and to preserve the E sound that I considered in my analysis of the poem so much important. So these are some of the strategies I used here. I'm not going to read this, and I wanted to read one of the things I'm most careful about when I translate, and I think this is one of the reasons why literature should be retranslated in Italy, is that in the Italian culture of translation, most of the literary texts were always translated with a very high register. Everything is always higher than it is in the original, because it's like in Italian, it doesn't sound poetic enough if it doesn't have like the adjectives before the noun, or parole tronche, amor, scordar, no? But it is not really what poetical language is about. So what I'm very careful about is the variation of registers. In Shakespeare as in T.S. Eliot, because T.S. Eliot can go very...
Key, totally.
Yeah, can be very low in his registers. And one example is, remember in The Wasteland, there's just this phrase that is stony rubbish. Stony rubbish. How would you translate? There are some Italians here. How would you translate rubbish? There are several options, but still, it is like rubbish. Rifiuti, mondizia, mondezza. In all the 20th century translation, rubbish is translated with rovine o macerie. And it's not a mistake, because they were like the greatest scholar we ever had. It was a choice. Its choice was that in the Italian poetry, we cannot afford such a low register as including rifiuti. But nowadays, we know we can, that it's not a sin, we won't be punished for that, more or less. So, and as for the rhythm, I'd like to read you a part from the fifth section, that is what the thunder said. And I worked a lot on the rhythm here, because it is necessary to hear the thunder, I think. So I'll read it in English. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying with a little patience. There is no water, but only rock, rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink amongst the rock. One cannot stop or think. Sweat is dry and feet are in the sand. If there were only water among the rock, that mountain, mouth of curious teeth that cannot spit. Here one cannot neither stand or lie nor sit. There is not even silence in the mountains, but dry sterile thunder without rain. There is not even solitude in the mountains, but red sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. I think I can stop here.
Whatever you like. You can continue if you want. You can go on. Mm-hmm.
If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water and spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but sound of water over a rock, where the termit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, 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 but there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead, up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? Vi leggo la mia traduzione. Dopo la luce della torcia rossa su facce sudate, dopo il silenzio di gelo nei giardini, dopo l'agonia nei luoghi di pietra, le grida e i pianti, prigione e palazzo e riverberazione, di tuono, di primavera sopra montagne distanti. Colui che era vivo adesso è morto, noi che eravamo vivi adesso stiamo morendo, con un po' di pazienza. Qui non c'è acqua ma solo roccia, roccia e non acqua è la strada di sabbia, la strada che si inerpica su tra le montagne, che sono montagne di roccia senza acqua. Se ci fosse acqua potremmo fermarci e bere, tra le rocce non puoi fermarti o pensare, il sudore è secco e i piedi stanno nella sabbia. Se ci fosse solo acqua tra le rocce, morta a bocca di montagna con i denti cariati che non sa sputare. Qui non si può stare in piedi né sdraiati né seduti, non c'è nemmeno silenzio tra le montagne, solo un tuono secco sterile senza pioggia, non c'è nemmeno solitudine tra le montagne, solo facce rosse e scontrose che ghignano e ringhiano da porte, di case, di fango crepato. Se ci fosse acqua e nessuna roccia, se ci fosse roccia e anche acqua è una fonte, una pozza tra le rocce, se ci fosse il suono dell'acqua soltanto, non la cicala e il canto dell'erba secca, ma suono d'acqua sopra una roccia dove il tordo eremita canta tra i pini, clof, clop, clof, clop, 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 ma non c'è acqua. Chi è il terzo che ti cammina sempre accanto? Quando conto, ci siamo solo io e te, ma quando guardo la strada bianca davanti, c'è sempre un altro che ti cammina accanto. Scivola avvolto in un manto marrone, incappucciato. Non so dire se sia un uomo o una donna, ma chi è che ti sta accanto dall'altra parte?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Can we? Should I wait to ask questions after Juliet, or ask
after
questions
Juliet?
Now? Okay, whatever you want. All right. Do you want me to? I'll start with read our Juliet.
Yeah, you can read Juliet. Now we're reading Juliet from Shakespeare, from Romeo and Juliet. It's quite a different challenge from Eliot, of course. It was hard to invent a language for a 13 girl that was living in Verona, and that is madly in love and is very eager to consume her marriage with Romeo. And what I try to do in this part, because sometimes when we think about Romeo and Juliet, especially in Italy, it's like the most boring story. Okay, they love and they decide to kill because they are happy. Yeah. And one of the reasons why I think Romeo and Juliet is partially not really understood in Italy is because that the way they speak in most translations is very Petrarchan. They really speak like this old-fashioned rhetorical discourse about love, and you really cannot get into their love because the way they speak is really something you cannot empathize with. It sounds like too literary. I mean, so what I try to do is to make Juliet's words sounds fresher, in a sense, like a 13 girl would speak about her love. So still literary, but not like she's reciting someone else's words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, this question of the audience that you're translating for. So this is Juliet's famous gallop apace speech, which I'll read in English, and then Carmen will read her translation into Italian. Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging. Such a wagoner as Phaeton would whip you to the west and bring in cloudy night immediately. Spread thy close curtain, love-performing night, that runaways' eyes may wink, and Romeo leap to these arms, untalked of and unseen. Lovers can see to do their amorous rites by their own beauties, or if love be blind, it best agrees with night. Come, civil knight, thou sober-suited matron all in black, and learn me how to lose a winning match, played for a pair of stainless maidenhoods. Hood my unmanned blood, bating in my cheeks, with thy black mantle, till strange love grow bold. Think true love acted simple modesty. Come, night, come, Romeo, come, thou day and night, for thou wilt lie upon the wings of night, whiter than new snow upon a raven's back. Come, gentle knight, come, loving black-browed knight, give me my Romeo, and when I shall die, take him and cut him out into little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun. Oh, I have bought the mansion of a love, but not possessed it, and though I am sold, not yet enjoyed. So tedious is this day, as is the night before some festival, to an impatient child that hath new robes and may not wear them.
I love this part. Just a few things before I read translation. You heard love performing night, just like come, love, come night is all about sex, and it's not, you get it, obviously. And night is also like night with the K before, so it is Romeo that is needs to come as soon as possible. Love performing night in previous translation is translated like, or night that protects lovers. Oh, night that, completely omitted the performing part of the love, because it's Juliet is speaking, so she cannot make a clear reference to the performance of love, not only from a meta-theatrical point of view, but physical point of view. So, al galoppo veloci, destrieri dai passi di fuoco, tornate alla casa di Febo. Se con la frusta vi spronasse un'auriga come Fetonte, sareste già a Occidente e sarebbero già arrivate le nuvole della notte. Stendi la tua coltre spessa, notte che metti in scena l'amore. Possano i fuggitivi chiudere gli occhi e Romeo fiondarsi tra queste braccia a riparo da voci e sguardi. Gli amanti celebrano i loro riti d'amore con la luce della loro bellezza, o se l'amore è cieco, meglio si accorda con la notte. Vieni, notte austera, tu sobria matrona vestita di nero, e insegnami a perdere una partita vincente, giocata da una coppia di vergini senza macchia. Il tuo mantello nero nasconde il sangue che a me, ignara di uomini, accende le guance, finché l'amore inesperto non si farà audace, pensando pure e casto l'atto del vero amore. Vieni notte, vieni Romeo, vieni tu giorno nella notte, che sulle ali del buio apparirai più bianco della neve fresca sul dorso di un corvo. Vieni notte gentile, vieni tenera nel tuo volto cupo, dammi il mio Romeo, e quando morirò prendilo e taglialo in tante piccole stelle, e il volto del cielo farà così bello che il mondo intero si innamorerà della notte, invece di venerare il sole vistoso. Ho comprato la dimora dell'amore, ma non la possiedo, e io stessa sono stata venduta, ma non ancora goduta. È noioso questo giorno come la notte prima di una festa, per una bambina impaziente che ha abiti nuovi e non può ancora indossarli. I love this book.
Le tue?
Okay, yeah. I was forgetting to read mine on purpose, but Isabella is very... in my last book, that is Procne Machine, I included some translations. The book is about the myth of Procne and Philomel. You probably know this myth, but Philomel has her tongue cut. And it is a myth that you find everywhere in English literature, for example, from Gascoigne to T.S. Eliot. And I decided to include this section where I translate male authors. And I do whatever I want. They're not really translation. I just take the parts that I like and I change when I want. It is like my book of poetry, so I can make whatever I want with other poets. I can read what What the Thrush Said by John Keats. Il tuo viso ha sentito il vento dell'inverno e i tuoi occhi hanno visto nella nebbia nubi di neve e le cime nere dell'olmo alte tra le stelle ghiacciate. Per te la primavera sarà tempo di raccolto e solo tu hai il libro della luce che ti ha nutrito nel buio supremo della notte senza febo. Per te la primavera sarà 3 volte mattino. Non preoccuparti di sapere, io non so nulla, eppure il mio canto innato arriva al primo caldo. Non preoccuparti di sapere, no scusate, chi si rattrista al pensiero dell'ozio non può essere ozioso ed è sveglio chi pensa di dormire. And then I can read last one that is by Thomas Hardy. It is a poem, this is The Darkling Thrush, but the previous title that I really like was On the Sentry's Deathbed. Improvvisa una voce si levò tra i rami spogli sopra la sua testa, in un canto serale e ricolmo di gioia illimitata. Un piccolo, vecchio, tordo, fragile, con le piume confuse, aveva scelto di scagliare la sua anima nell'oscurità crescente. Così poche ragioni per canti natalizi di suono così estatico erano scritte sulle cose terrene, vicine o lontane, che pensai che lì tremasse, nell'aria serena della sua buonanotte, una qualche speranza di benedizione, di cui lui sapeva e io ero ignaro.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Beautiful readings. And I have some notes with questions that I think it might make sense to actually return to once Patrizio does his reading. I'm going to just keep my notes here and we'll also open it up to the audience. And so, Patrizio, yes.
If you want, I'll give you a sample in both directions. We start with this popular poem selected by Carmen Gallo from Storia, this awarded book by Antonella Nedda, which came out with New York Review Books in 2023. And so it was a way to thank Edwin Frank, who is talking next on the stage, for thanking him for believing on this book. And it starts with a quote from W.H. Auden, and that Antonella Nedda translated. And yesterday I met in a restaurant uptown Professor Mendelssohn, who is a world authority on Auden's poetry, and so it's serendipitous to read this poem. Amore. Assomiglia a un pigiama. Il suo odore fa pensare a un lama. W.H. Auden. Oh, dite che cos'è davvero amore. Somiglia a un pigiama e ha un odore di lama. E ci sono altre cose. L'asciugamano che si può scambiare. Le poltrone vicine davanti al televisore, l'insofferenza per le reciproche mancanze, che però si svuota come si fa con le buste della spesa. Molte leggende, il sesso sopravvalutato, ma non la solitudine che segue, il resto è molto poco. Quando morì mia madre, mio padre radunò i vestiti, se li mise sul petto, un cumulo di stoffa, e restò a lungo così, sotto quel peso di calore, una notte e un giorno, per poi alzarsi e innaffiare le piante già secche sul balcone. In this case, obviously, I read the original in Italian. I would like to ask Isabella to read the English translation made by Susan. And, yeah.
Thank you. Love. Does it look like a pair of pajamas? Does its odor remind one of llamas? Auden, oh, tell me the truth about love. It looks like pajamas and smells like llamas, and there's more. The shared towel, the armchairs side by side in front of the TV, insufferable mutual shortcomings emptied out like endless shopping bags. Plenty of legends, the overestimated sex, but not the solitude that comes next. The rest doesn't amount to much. When my mother died, my father gathered up all her clothes. He piled them on his chest, a heap of fabric. He stayed like that for a long while under that warm weight. A night and a day, only to then come back to stand and water the plants already dry on the patio.
Thank you. And I will read now from this book, which is the second volume that Susan Stewart and I translated from Milo De Angelis, the first one being Theme of Farewell and After Poems, which gathered together two collections of poetry, Tema dell'addio, quell'andarsene nel buio dei cortili, from 2005-2010. And this book, which is gonna be released on the 26th of April by a Brooklyn Press, Archipelago Books. We're gonna launch it in Kansas at the Raven Bookstore on the 28th. I'm so happy to read for the first time from it. And I'm gonna read a few poems, if you please. The first one has a German title, Still Nacht. Ha invocato il sonno, ma il sonno era acqua che si spezza. Un'alba sottoterra e ancora quel terrore di chiudere la porta. Pregavi, ma non per risorgere o per un altro sogno celeste. Chiedevi un'altra giornata. Chiedevi di non compiere adesso il volo deciso dai lampi. Chiedevi di illuminare l'aria solitaria. Chiedevi un'arte più serena di te, un tenero negozio umano dove troverai le stagioni perdute che rinascono stasera. O congiungere il respiro al tuo segno zodiacale, appoggiare la tua storia a una cittadinanza, vivere per sempre la notte silenziosa.
Stille Nacht. You called for sleep, but sleep was water that falls apart, an underground dawn, and still that terror of closing the door. You prayed, but not for resurrection or for another heavenly dream. You were asking for another day. You were asking for this moment to go on, the flight determined by lightning. You asked that the solitary hour be lit. You asked for an art more serene than you are, a tender human bargain where you will find the lost seasons that are reborn this evening. Oh, to join the breath to your zodiac sign, to prop your story to a citizenship, to live forever the silent night.
Thank you. We still talk about sleeping with another foreign title, Bon Dodo. Bon Dodo, Bon Dodo, Bon Dodo. Ti dicevano alle 9 di sera, ma non potevi dormire, troppo forte risuonavano le campane nel cimitero della tua stanza e tu hai imparato subito che i morti non restano fermi, entrano nel sonno di ogni bambino. Oh, quanta terra sparsa sul cuscino, quanti baci di puro spavento, quanta neve sulle lenzuola, quante volte si accartoccia l'albero del noce, quante volte.
Bon dodo. Bon dodo, bon dodo, bon dodo, they said to you at 9 in the evening, but you couldn't sleep, and the bells clanged too loudly in the graveyard of your room, and you learned right away that the dead do not stand still. They enter into the sleep of each child. Oh, how much earth scattered on the pillow, how many kisses of pure fright, how much snow on the sheets, how many times the walnut tree collapses on itself, how many times.
And I will read the last poem from the book Last Stops of the Night Journey by Milo De Angelis, that is called Mercoledì, to launch the third and final panel of today that is devoted to Cesare Pavese, for Giulia. Mercoledì, al Parco della Rimembranza, nella nebbia del nord, nel giorno del tuo compleanno, non potevo trovare che lui. Guardava per terra le castagne appena cadute e si divertiva a spingerle nel fosso con il piede sinistro, con quelle scarpe anni 30 che gli davano un'insolita eleganza. Lo guardai da lontano, magro, pensoso, proteso a un'eterna stagione che sfiora tutti noi passeggeri. Lui solitario per forza e per natura. Guardava i bambini in bicicletta con una strana attenzione. Raccoglieva gli emblemi dell'inizio e della fine. Sentiva forse che era ormai breve il suo segmento, e camminava sempre più lento con un grido nel sangue che solo i poeti possono scorgere. Alla fine si sedette su una panchina con il suo dattiloscritto dalle 1000 correzioni fatte a penna che teneva sulle ginocchia, e scriveva, e io ero un ragazzo e non sapevo nulla di lui, ma guardai a lungo quel titolo, La luna e i falò.
Wednesday. At the Park of Remembrance in the northern mist, on his birthday, I could only find him. He was looking at the chestnuts freshly fallen on the ground and amused himself by pushing them into the ditch with his left foot, with those 30s-style shoes that gave him an unusual elegance. I watched him from a distance, slender, thoughtful, reaching out to an eternal season that touches all of us passengers. Solitary by will and by nature, he was watching the children on their bicycles with a strange attention. He gathered the emblems of the beginning and the end. Perhaps he felt that his time at this point was short, and he walked slower and slower with a cry in his blood that only poets can catch. Finally, he sat down on a bench with his typescript on his knees, with 1,000 corrections made in pen, and was writing, and I was a boy and knew nothing about him, but I looked at that title for a long time, The Moon and the Bonfires.
Thank you, Isabella. Do we have the time?
Yeah, we have time.
So if you have the time, I would like to ask Isabella to start with the original, which this time is in English, from a book by Anne Carson called Red Dog, published in New York in 2013. I submitted the manuscript of my first Italian translation to La Nave di Teseo at the end of March, and I'm waiting to revise the book that gave me so many troubles, very difficult book to translate. I grew very fond of it, and this part not only speaks about Italy as many other poems and works by Anne Carson, speaks about the Punic War, and I find it very, very timely to be read today. And so, thank you, Isabella.
Thank you. While with sad, he knows, don't mention warplay. Funny word, warplay. Never says war or warfare. I've seen a lot of warplay, he'd say. Warplay had me pumped those years. Tip of the spear, flip switch inside. She hit the ground 75, saw the white bag, 75 bullets tore her head off. I saw her hand. I wasn't going to tell anyone back home about. Oh, it found its way out, it surfaced. I had a tan when I came home, no wounds, no cuts. Everyone kissed me. Sure, I sat by the fire, I talked to the old man. There were the smells, the bone beneath. Sweat broke out on me at breakfast. I didn't expect to come home, that was not in the plan. Some point, I guess, the brain cells just give out. You read 100 military manuals, you won't find the word kill, they trick you into killing. You get over it, it's okay. You have to. Fear not tolerated. Take you out back and shoot you, they say. Her eyeglasses in the grass. Standard questionnaire. Fine, just say fine. Numb yourself. Wireframe. Does it feel good at first? Yes. Play, guns, fire, animals. You know the Carthaginians liked to use oxen for night fighting. I'm talking about Hannibal. I'm talking about the Battle of Ager Falernus, 217 BC. Like tanks, but more frightening. They'd tie lit torches to the horns and stampede them toward the enemy. The Romans panicked, some ran into the herd, some got knocked off the path to the crags below, others tried to retreat and were lost in the tundra, never seen again. But what about, I'm asking, what happens when the torches burn down to the horn, to the hair, to the head, to the bone beneath? So much human cruelty is simply incidental, is simply brainless, simply no common sense. You could take the entirety of the common sense of humans and put it in the palm of your hand and still have room for your dick.
So, excuse our French, as we say in English. And today, this morning, Nicoletta Verna, she's the winner of the Bridge Prize for Fiction this year, said that war sucks, is una schifezza, and should be represented as such by literature. And it actually, that's what happens in post-fascist Italy. And so don't torch my ox in my name, I would say, by reading you this poem by Anne Carson. And this also gives me the opportunity to thank Maria Ida Gaeda, all the organizer of this event and the prize, for having me here today. Thank you. Quando è contriste sa che non bisogna menzionare il gioco della guerra. Buffa espressione, il gioco della guerra. Non dice mai guerra o conflitto bellico. Ho visto molti giocare alla guerra, diceva. I giochi di guerra mi entusiasmavano in quegli anni. Punta della lancia, Interruttore interno. Lei è caduta a terra, 75, ho visto la sacca bianca, 75 proiettili gli hanno staccato la testa, ho visto la sua mano. Non avevo intenzione di dirlo a nessuno a casa. Oh, ha trovato la sua via d'uscita, è venuto a galla. Ero abbronzato quando sono tornato a casa, nessuna ferita, nessun taglio. Tutti mi hanno baciato. Certo, mi sono seduto accanto al fuoco, ho parlato con il vecchio, c'erano gli odori, le ossa sotto, il sudore mi è scoppiato addosso a colazione. Non mi aspettavo di tornare a casa, non era nei piani. A un certo punto immagino che le cellule cerebrali semplicemente cedano. Se leggi un centinaio di manuali militari, non troverai mai la parola uccidere, ti inducono a uccidere. Lo superi, va bene, devi farlo. La paura non è tollerata, ti portano sul retro e ti sparano, dicono. Gli occhiali di lei nell'erba, questionario standard, bene, di solo bene, anestetizzati. Montatura in filo metallico, all'inizio è piacevole, sì. Un gioco, pistole, fuoco, animali. Tu sai che i cartaginesi amavano usare i buoi nei combattimenti notturni? Sto parlando di Annibale, sto parlando della battaglia del campo Salerno del 217 a.C., dei carri armati, ma più spaventosi. Gli legavano delle torce alle corna e li lanciavano alla carica contro il nemico. Fu il panico tra i romani. Alcuni si scontrarono con la mandria, altri furono spinti fuori dal sentiero verso le rocce sottostanti, altri ancora cercarono di ritirarsi e si persero nella tundra, senza essere mai più ritrovati. Ma a che pensare, mi chiedo, cosa succede quando le torce bruciano fino al corno, alla pelliccia, alla testa e all'osso sottostante? Tanta crudeltà umana è semplicemente accidentale, è semplicemente scervellata, semplicemente priva di buonsenso. Potresti prendere tutto il buonsenso degli esseri umani e metterlo nel palmo della tua mano e avere ancora spazio per il tuo uccello. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This is so beautiful. I want to spend the next, let's say, 10 minutes, then we'll give 5 minutes of space before the next panel, asking some specific questions. I will say, I mean, I guess a few things about the wasteland, Carmen, that you can kind of take what you are most interested in. How did you decide on the title? La terra devastata, especially given what you were talking to us about with rubbish, rifiuti, waste, you know, this echo with the title. I'm curious, did you listen at all to recordings of Elliot? This is something I just, you know, I have Elliot's voice in my head from, it's such a, and I'm curious in your work with rhythm, can you tell us a little bit more about your work with rhythm? I was interested as well in the specific choice. You have mudcracked, which is this kind of difficult question of what we do with compound adjectives when translating into Italian, and there's some kind of creative ways to handle that. You did fango crepato, which is also very evocative. I'm curious how you reached this particular choice. And my last question is about the third. The third, which in Italian, in English you're not forced to specify the gender with the third. And then Eliot says, or the poetic voice says, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, right? Whereas you had to make the choice of il terzo. And so I'm curious, again, another choice, how did you negotiate that?
I'll start with that because I'm not sure I'm going to remember the previous questions. So the last one is easier to remember, but you can help me. In that case, I had a lot of problems with all my translations with this, the problem of the gender of pronouns. You mentioned before Kyril Churchill's, my translation of Kyril Churchill's, her play, the title was Lives of Great Poisoners. But actually all the poisoners in the play were women except one. So if I had to translate literally, it was Le vite di grandi avvelenatori. He would have completely omitted the fact that most of them are women. So lots of problems. In this case, it was easier because thanks to Eliot's notes that are sometimes reliable, sometimes not, but that is a reference to Emmaus, the voyage to Emmaus in the Bible, where they were all men. So I feel somehow authorized to use the male form, even though he says that it can be a man, but in the Bible, patriarchal things, it was easier. And for the rhythm, I used free verse in most of the translation, except from a few lines in which there were echoes of Spenser's, and so I thought that some material decisions could be more appropriate. I read the part about the thunder, but for example, the fourth part, that is death by water, I try to evoke with the translation a softer sound, a very calm sound, because it's the sound of a corpse that is floating and then is very slowly going into the deep of the sea. And your first question was very interesting, even though the title, I was the first to change the title of this book in Italian after a century, and it's very easy. Waste is a word that comes from Latin vastus, that is the same word that is contained in the devastata. So there was a stronger connection, and I felt that devastata today, devastata and desolata in the history of the Italian language were synonyms for a long time, but nowadays they are not. Desolata is a desert. There is no responsibility for that. If you say devastata, you are like making clear that someone is responsible for that devastation. And since I thought that history and war and post-war Europe is a key theme in the wasteland, I wanted to suggest this idea of destruction more than the atemporal, historical dimension of myth. As Eliot says, he uses mythical method, as we all know, and he says that is a way to give sense to contemporary history. So I wanted Eliot's contemporary history to emerge more clearly from the title itself. And as Hannah Sullivan says, in 1922, probably everybody who read the poem and read the title, Wasteland, thought about post-war Europe devastation. It's like calling a book of poetry today Lockdown, and it can be about Augustine monks, but still it evokes our own experience of what lockdowns were in very recent times. So I wanted to give this idea of something that was more related to history and to war and to violence in the wasteland. And the title was a perfect occasion to give this idea. And then I had this philological help from Latin and vastus and devastata.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great. I wanted to ask, before I kind of open it up to the audience, asking you, Patrizio, I was noticing in the Pavese in Mercoledì Wednesday, De Angelis on Pavese, there is quite a typographical difference in terms of the layout on the page, where the Italian lines, the enjambment is quite, it looks like, I don't know if you can see it, but I mean, you can kind of see it in the blocks of text, right? That the English version is longer, which it almost feels strange to me, because I'm always thinking about how whenever I'm translating myself into Italian, I'm like, oh my God, this is so much longer. But so what is how did you guys handle this typographic differences, the length of the lines? What choices did you make here?
That's a very interesting question. Usually we associate English to a concision that Italian lacks of, and so usually the problem of a translator is to remain as concise as the English can be. In this case, translating from Italian long verse by Milo is clearly avoiding traditional measures and writing in long verse, and especially in this late style. We are translators of the last 4 books of Milo, which are an example of at least a second phase, or if not a late phase of his career, which tends to be more limpid than the Orphic early poem from the 70s on to the 90s. And this new millennium poem tend to be characterized by these long lines, and we, in a way, reproduce that in English, careful to, I think, to first be faithful to the content, and then and we didn't try to shorten it up, in other words, in English, even if it seems counterintuitive. But yes, we managed to create a longer verse than the original one.
Yeah, it's really striking, and it's fascinating. I have more questions. Maybe I'll ask one more, if that's okay, or do you want me to open it up to the audience? We have to move on. Oh, so the audience can't.
I mean, yes, we have 2 minutes.
Okay, let's do that. Sì, lo so. We're late. Can I ask anybody? We have a question right there.
Hi, thanks. I guess it's directed to Patrizio, but it also would apply in terms of the Anne Carson, but it would also apply to the Eliot as well. But in the Anne Carson, since on the surface her language is so compact and condensed, but the trajectory is actually like millions of years, in the making. So, I mean, she's mastered that kind of fast curveball playing in the writing itself, obviously. How did you deal with it in terms of the translation, in terms of the cadence and the meaning, and bringing it back down and escalating the language at the same time?
Yeah, so that's a very complicated question to answer briefly. But yes, the authors I translated are very different. Aneda, at least in this book, Historia, has a very limpid almost prose-like verse, free verse. And Carson, especially in this book, Red Dog, is a very complicated book to translate, because it's a book of the experience of trauma, of Heracles turned into a post-traumatic stress disease patient in a clinic. So it's a kind of demystification, so to speak, of the Western hero epic in a language that at times is incomprehensible. And so I resisted the temptation to clarify that, to explain everything. Even at the risk of sounding like a bad translation, I preserved some difficulties in the text, some blunt, abrupt, twisted form of this convoluted, at times concise imagery and language. And I hope it works. I still have to revise it, so I still have time to redeem myself or to improve it. But yes, it's a difficult task. It's a very difficult task because, especially with Carson, I feel I'm not a translator who just has to find the best solution, but primarily an interpreter of the text, and that obviously can be done differently. And Carson doesn't want to explain herself, doesn't want to be clarified, doesn't want me to explain her, and I try to deal with that, in producing a language that has the same level of complexity and defying linearity and simplicity.
Do we have to cut? We have to cut. Oh, we have one more. Okay, one more question. Okay, va bene. One more question. One more question. And right here, can you raise your hand so that our
a question for both of you. I was wondering, because I I am a scholar and a translator too, so I find lots of problems when I work in translating authors whom I know too much. So I want to know what's the limit somehow you have to put yourself when you translate. So how much interpretive activity and scholarly activity on poets, for instance, can be, on the one hand, something that makes you even stronger as a translator, on the other hand, a risk, because you risk being paralyzed. That's what happens to me usually. Too much sense in too many words. Every word means too much, and you don't know how to manage and to convey the final sense of a text. So it's a question because it's a problem for me. So I was wondering if you can help me.
Getting out of parallel. When I was translating Eliot, that's the case, for example, because like you have so many several meanings and you can have very different interpretations. The solution there wasn't very brave, but it was that I added a commentary at the end. There's 100 pages of commentary to the text. So I could put there all the things. It was not everything. I had to negotiate with the publisher to add all the weirdest interpretations I had. But while I was really translating the text, I did I studied a lot. I've been studying Eliot for years. Of course, I've been reading all the new materials, all the updated criticism on it. But while I was translating his poetry, I wasn't studying anymore. It was just me and the poem. I was not even reading or rereading previous translation. It was just me, and it was a battle. It was a war between us. And just at the end, when I had completed my translation, I decided to add a commentary where all the things that I had been thinking, all the alternative versions or interpretations, I decided to put them there. But when you think only about translating the poem and using your language and to challenge the limits of your language, you completely forget everything. It's just poetry, and that's the fun of it, I think.
Well, I won't dare to say that I penetrated that inscrutable brilliance that you can find in Anne Carson's work. So I never feel that I know her so well that is too much. She still manages to surprise me, and so I actually have a scholarly approach to my translation, also as a form of curiosity. I like to linger around the text, also because I like the process. I don't want to let it go. So, for instance, when I translated Norma Jean Baker of Troy, which is a modern rendition of Helen, but with Marilyn Monroe in the place of Helen, I watch all Marilyn Monroe's movie with my wife at home to be ready to translate. Of course, I read also the ancient Greek tragedy and the scholarly work around it. And now, for instance, I'm about to translate in the summer Antigonique with an Italian poet, Elisa Biagini, so another collaboration. And I've been already rereading my Antigone, which was my tragedy for my Liceo Classico Esame di Maturità, my final national exam. So it's a nostalgic operation, and I am reading, Zizek, Butler, and all the scholars, Hegel, who engage with Antigone as a part of my understanding of the tradition and the premises of the text, but eventually just responded to Anne and her language, and so. Every book can ask for a different response, I think, but I don't have enough of it yet, I think. I'll continue a little longer.
If I can add something to Luca, probably one way of getting out of paralysis is thinking about translation as something that never ends. It is a never-ending process. I have a copy of all my translations in which I keep on working, even if nobody will ever be interested, probably, in my own corrections and my alternatives. But still, you get out of paralysis just considering that it never ends. It can go on forever. Who cares?
Thank you so much to both of our speakers today, to Patrizio and to Carmen, for joining us.